Okay, what about the institution of slavery then? We'll go to a real life world. Do you think that owning slaves then in the South, that was necessarily a morally neutral thing because it was just part of the system, and if you were gone, another slave owner would just step up?
No, I think that it's worthwhile to criticize those institutions.
Why?
The people who
No, not the institutions. Don't. I'm
sure.
being.
Yeah.
I am okay. Just real clear. I'm being very
white supremacist.
Careful to be incredibly precise with my language. I'm asking you to do the same. Okay. I'm not talking about the institutions, and I'm not talking about how you feel. I'm asking, do you think it is morally neutral to be a slave owner? For if you weren't a slave owner, someone else would just step up and own your slaves for you.
Plenty of slave owners freed their slaves after they passed away. That was like a common thing to do. So.
Okay, look at you making excuses for slavery. Adam.
They knew what they were doing. They knew what they were doing. Well, no, if you're freeing your slaves after you pass away, you knew what you were doing was fucked up. Like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
Yeah, so why didn't you do it while you were alive?
Yes,
like,
exactly.
I'm dead now. I extract no benefit from this transaction.
Exactly. I'm not saying it's right here, Sitch. I'm just pointing out the reality of the situation.
You're pointing out that people doing that shows, that they're hypocritical.
Fuck yeah, people are hypocrites. Wake up.
Morally neutral.
No, I don't think slave owning was like a slot thing where like if you aren't owning the slaves, then someone else steps up to own this. I don't necessarily know if it works that way. The reason why
he does realize that like people bought slaves in a market, right?
But I was about to say, like, by nature of it being in like an auction format, if you don't put that paddle up, someone else will.
Totally. Totally.
Did he think that like plantation workers actually went over to Africa and went into like the forest and were looking for black people in the forest to abduct? Like, then that's what the plantation. So it's like, oh well, look, if I don't go and hunt them down in the forest, then
no one else will. Yeah.
Well,
no one necessarily else will. Yeah.
That argument would work better if that's how it actually worked, but that's
exactly.
not how it worked at all.
Slavery was a massive in the South.
The reason why I'm saying this about landlords and cops specifically is because the way those institutions work, especially with landowning, literally require that those institutions exist.
Wait, you don't think the
So crazy. I can't believe he's saying this. I can't believe he's saying this.
Yeah.
Like he's literally making the argument for slavery now. Like,
well, no, he's going to say, I think an argument that we've had before, where he's going to make the argument that, well, it's necessary in our society for someone to own property. It's necessary for cops to exist, but it wasn't necessary for slavery. Therefore, it's different.
Oh, okay. I thought he was making the argument that they needed the slaves. I thought that's what he just said. Was I incorrect?
But,
no, he's going to make the opposite argument.
But the interesting thing about this is that you would argue that it's necessary in that if you don't become a landlord, somebody's gonna in our current society, but somebody was gonna own that slave.
Yeah.
So even if you defined the society didn't need it to happen, I'd be like, but it's happening. It is happening. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so he's adding a qualifier that's like a weasel qualifier because it doesn't really relate to his actual point, but it creates a distinction.
I gotta back up a few seconds. I want to make sure I'm getting this correct.
Is because the one else steps up to own this. I don't necessarily know if it works that way.
The reason why I'm saying,
the reason why I'm saying this about landlords and cops specifically is because the way those institutions work, especially with landowning, literally require that those institutions exist.
Wait, you don't think the agricultural economic organization of the South required slavery to exist?
Not in the same way. An individual house in a commodified housing system is either owned by an individual or what? That's it. You either own it or you rent it out to or a company owns it or something. But with slavery, there wasn't institutional slots where it's required. When you're a slave owner,
wait, how is it not institutional? They literally have whole laws on the books regarding the ownership of slaves.
To a demand for slavery in a way that the housing market doesn't have. If you're a landowner and you rent a property, you can't throw your hands up in the air and say nope, I back out, and then that property disappears.
Wait, I don't think that's relevant. I'm just asking because it feels to me like you're falling back on this argument.
Yeah, I was about to say because the most you could do as a property owner, I guess, is demolish the house and put molten lead all over the lawn.
And the equivalent would be to kill the slave.
He brings it up though.
Slave now.
He brings it up though. You can live in the property. You could make owning property. You could make renting out property illegally. You'd have to.
Yeah, you could just
any
have
property
people have empty houses, you know, that they can't use.
Well, no, you would never buy a second house. If you can't make money as a landlord, you'd never buy a second house. He makes that argument. Destiny does.
This isn't the root of this argument. If we were to bring it to the slavery example, would be if there is a bunch of abolitionists who are crying every day. Their entire deal is that they're known for going on the street corner and telling everyone about the evils of slavery, but then every night they walk home to their fucking plantation full of slaves, and you're like, what are you doing? You're a hypocrite. And they say, but wait a minute, I'm just living within the system currently as it is.
Which, by the way, I actually would posit that like there's a potential there that they're still consistent in that they're like, yes, we buy as many slaves as we can. Check out the way they live on our plantation.
Right.
And
right.
Like,
you could add, yeah.
But of course, that's not relevant to this, which is no, they actually just fully engage in it. They're just your standard slaves. But in their spare time, for money, they advocate that you shouldn't do slaves. It's
right.
like, but you do.
If Vaush didn't have to defend his fellow bread tubers, he could make that argument. He could say, you, as I said earlier, you can own property, and if it would actually be morally good for you to buy property if you have the money and rent it out without making profit. That would be a moral good according to socialists.
Yeah.
So it'd be
why doesn't he just say that?
You can buy slaves, but then you treat them like normal people as if they're not enslaved, but you're just doing it because you're basically protecting them from the system.
Why not just buy them and let them go, Sitch? Jeez, well, so stingy.
You do that too, specifically because if you don't, someone else will come along, which is what Vaush was advocating for.
And recapture them.
Well, do whatever, right? There was some real mean people out there.
Argument that you're appealing to figure out if something is worth like condemning or not is whether or not like somebody on an individual level is whether or not somebody else would step up to replace you. So I think it's fair to say in the South, slavery was a big institution, and if you aren't going to own
it was a big institution, but like if you own a collection of apartment buildings, that someone has to own that. Like you can't, otherwise it turns into a Ranshack tenement. Like
yeah, sure, but if you own slaves in the South, like if we go before.
Who built these apartments? I mean, I
just think this is again the fog. Like we're not addressing the easy point. We're avoiding it.
He's acting like these apartments just like someone waved a magic wand and oh, now we have these apartments. No,
they just spawn out of the ground, Adam. I played Minecraft. You just walk long enough and you find villages.
If nobody steps up to build apartments, then there's not going to be any apartments. Some would argue that it's good people do step up to build apartments because it gives people places to live. So.
Before like the Emancipation Proclamation, if we go before like slaves are allowed to be free anywhere, black people are allowed to be free anywhere, somebody has to own those slaves. It's not like you can just set them free, right?
But the only reason slaves were brought across the Atlantic was because there was a market demand for them over here. If people didn't keep buying slaves, then they wouldn't have had the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah, but if you don't buy it, someone else is.
Works literally requires those institutions.
But if you don't buy those slaves, somebody else will.
Not if there are fewer people buying slaves, they bring less slaves over the Atlantic.
Okay, if you're going to make that argument, then I'm going to say if there are fewer people evicting tenants, then there are fewer tenants being evicted. Or if there are fewer cops making drug busts, then there are fewer people getting arrested for doing drugs. Like that breaks your other two arguments you gave earlier.
No, it would be good to not drug bust.
No, don't do this equivocation. I'm not saying it would be good not blah, blah, blah. Earlier you said that the action of evicting a tenant or the action of petitioning the government to evict a tenant or the action of arresting somebody for drugs would be morally neutral because if you were to stop doing it, somebody else would just step in and
petitioning the government. The whole point of the institutional critique is to get the government to implement laws that make society better. I don't think there's any justification, whether or not you're participating in the system, to fight against those laws when they're implemented.
This is like there's so many people who grift on fighting racism. And it's very easy because they can say, oh, well, I don't have to point out specific acts of racism. It's all systemic. And it's very easy for a politician to say, well, I'm going to fight this intangible, invisible, etherical, systemic racism. I can't really point to it. I really can't grab it, but it's there. It's everywhere. It's all around us. But don't worry, I'm going to fight it. Because then they never have to actually show results for fighting that said invisible racism. And I guess it's kind of the same thing that Vaush is advocating for, where he's like, well, you should just fight the systems, right? These systems that will probably never change, and I, as Vaush or any other breadtuber, don't have the power to change, but I'll just keep fighting. I'll keep fighting.
Winks to the camera.